1:02. Shall we start?
Yes, let's go ahead. At least the introduction part can get going. There may be a few more people who will join, but we can go ahead.
Okay, great. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Harvard CRCS Social Impact Seminar Series. We are very happy to have Haifeng as our speaker today. Haifeng is the Alan Batson Assistant Professor in Computer Science at the University of Virginia and also a visiting research scientist at Google. He studies decision-making and machine learning in multi-agent environments, particularly in informationally complex settings, especially when there is limited access to information and data. Prior to University of Virginia, he was a postdoc at Harvard, and he obtained his PhD in computer science from University of Southern California, and Millen was one of his advisors. His research has been recognized by multiple prestigious awards such as Google Faculty Research Award, Honorable Mention for ACM's ICOM Dissertation Award, runner-up for the AMA's Victor Lesser Distinguished Dissertation Award, and a Google PhD Fellowship, and multiple Best Paper Awards. So today he'll be speaking on algorithmic information design, and we welcome you, Haifeng. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Arpita. It's really great to come back. Not only, Melina is my advisor, I actually was a postdoc at CRCS as well. So great to see many new faces here. I'll start by share my screen maybe. Do you guys see my slides?
Yes, all looks good.
Okay, good. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So hello, everyone. I'll get started. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about algorithmic information design. So many of us are familiar with another very well-known field called. Oh, sorry. This actually. Hold on. I think that was an old slide. Let me change it to an. I was supposed to show another slide. Sorry, guys, I should have shared another slide. Okay, yeah, sorry. So yeah, I'll talk about the algorithmic information design. So many of us are familiar with another very widely studied field, mechanism design. So here, you are trying to design the incentives of strategic agents, typically by designing the game rules or the interaction rules, so that you can steer their collective decisions towards some desirable social outcome. In the past 2 decades, this has been a very flourishing field with a lot of computational studies on the properties of mechanisms. And to date, these have led to a very mature algorithmic theory, and impressively with many successful deployed applications as well. For example, there are mechanisms that are designed to efficiently exchange kidneys, to fairly divide common properties, or to allocate the spectrum brands for the government in order to maximize welfare. And in this talk, what I'm going to talk about is a close cousin of mechanism design, but it turns out to be far less explored. This is what people now call the information design. In particular, instead of designing the incentives of strategic agents or designing the game rule, what we will try to design is the information that agents can access. And therefore, we can similarly influence agents' behavior. Why this is an important task? Well, because decisions are not only affected by incentives, but also profoundly affected by various information of uncertainties that are rife in our reality today. Indeed, this kind of study of decision-making under uncertainty and under incomplete information is nothing new. There's a very extensive research in this space, including even the 1994 Nobel Prize in Economics about incomplete information games, for example. However, what is new is the study of how to proactively disclose information so that we can strategically steer agents' collective decision towards some desirable outcome. And this line of research has only begun recently. And that's what we're going to cover today. However, even the research has only begun recently, but in reality, information disclosure is already ubiquitous. So one good example is actually the online marketplaces. The Black Friday, just passed last week. I guess many of you probably have done this kind of online shopping, and I did that as well. I'm not sure whether you have noticed that nowadays when you are trying to shop online, there were a lot of important information that will be shown to you in order to influence your purchase behavior. So a good example that we often see is on Amazon. Typically, you would see a disclosure of the inventory information. They're going to say only 2 left in the stock, so you should order soon. This is another example which shows a message saying 10 people have this in their cart, and this kind of information is kind of affecting our purchase behavior. This is a good example where information disclosure is affecting our decisions in everyday life. So information design also happens a lot nowadays in professional domains. For example, Uber has proposed this kind of search map, which tells you the demand information at the different locations of the city. Therefore, all the drivers is going to go to this popular area, and that actually leads to the well-known problem where Uber, we lack Uber drivers on some less popular area. That's kind of actually a problem that Uber faces. But regardless of the problem, this kind of information disclosure is a fact that's really happening now. Similarly, in advertising auctions, the auctioneer is going to reveal information to bidders as well. Another very widely seen example is recommender systems, such as Google Map or Yelp. Other applications including, really can think of anything. Marketing, elections, information disclosure in elections, negotiation and regulation. That's why nowadays, most people would never choose a road with a car accident, and then most people would go to the very, toply rated restaurants on Yelp. Again, so that is also why, we kind of see this top-rated restaurant from Yelp usually have a long line, and we see very few Uber drivers to pick up at this less popular area. Again, whether this is truly good or truly good for the welfare, that is, that's another question. But the fact that this kind of information disclosure are affecting many decisions that we're making in our life. So that is why I think it's kind of important to have a mature algorithmic theory that are tailored for today's large-scale automated application with millions of users. And that can help us that can guide us to design the best scheme so that we can improve the welfare of the system. And this is what has been missing in the past decade in this kind of AI and the computational game theory literature. The goal of this talk is I try to select I'm going to use a carefully selected subset of results from the research that I've been doing in the past 5 years, and hopefully I can paint a sketch for you about the landscape of algorithmic information design that are motivated by real-world problems. For the application domain, I'm going to try to shift away from those internet applications. Instead, I will focus on the sustainability domain. So I'm going to show how information disclosure can also be strategically used to improve wildlife conservation, which have been, important goals for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well. Okay, any questions so far? Good. So for the remaining of the talk, I'll basically have two major parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the computation and algorithms for optimal information design. And then I'll look at the learnability of the optimal design from samples. In each part, I'll try to highlight how the real-world application problems have led to the study of fundamental research questions. So let's start with motivation for information design in the domain of conservation. We all know that protecting endangered animals is a very important problem facing us today. And illegal poaching has been a major threat for endangered animals. For example, from 2010 to 2012, just within 3 years, about 20% of the elephants in Africa has been killed. Recently, there has been the trend of using these conservation drones to combat this poaching behavior. Actually, there are nonprofit organizations such as Air Shepherd, which is one of them, which are trying to specialize in using conservation drones in order to deter poaching. Due to the recent advances in the computer vision techniques, nowadays we can use a drone to automatically detect the poachers from the videos that the drone was taking. However, an important operational challenge facing the drone or Air Shepherd today is, after detecting the poacher, what are we going to do? Right? Because the drone cannot come down and directly catch the poacher. Therefore, the hope here is that if there were rangers nearby at this moment, then the drone can inform the rangers nearby to come to catch the poacher. But the problem here is that poaching actually usually happens during night, and therefore it's often that there were very few rangers are really nearby and are available to come to catch the poacher. Therefore, the probability that there is a ranger nearby is going to be very low. The question is, how can we handle this situation? How can we still deter poaching in such kind of situation? Next, I'm going to show you an example where, it turns out that you can use strategic information disclosure to deter the poaching behavior. To be concrete, let's consider the moment where, let's say the Air Shepherd deterred a poacher who is about to killing the animals. And here's a drone that's flying during night. At this moment, this can be viewed as a game played between the Air Shepherd and the poacher. To make the instance more concrete, let's say there's in such a situation, there's a probability 0.3 that a ranger is gonna be nearby and can come to catch the poacher. Now, when the poacher sees such a kind of, at this moment, the poacher can have one of the following two actions. Either he can choose to continue poaching and kill the animals. In this case, he will get utility slightly below -1 if he gets caught, or he's gonna get a reward 1 if he didn't get caught after the poaching. Another option for the poacher is to stop poaching and run away. In this case, he will get utility 0 and nothing happens. By the way, these utility numbers here are just set just for your ease of thinking. So in general, they can be arbitrary number. And the poacher has, he has learned the probability that a ranger is going to show up from his past experience in this field. And at this moment, the poacher is trying to make a decision between continue poaching or stop poaching. And as you can see, the poacher. So what he's gonna do is he can calculate the expected utility for different actions. If he continue poaching, he will get utility depends on the probability, which is 0.3 for a ranger nearby, and 0.7 is no ranger nearby. And this expected utility turns out to be significantly larger than the probability for him to run, than the utility for him to run away, which is 0. Therefore, the poacher gonna choose to continue poaching. And in this case, we're gonna say, the probability of continue poaching is 1, and the probability for him run away is 0. Now, from the air shepherd's perspective, they have a different objective. They want to maximize the probability that the poacher runs away, because an animal getting killed is a huge loss for the air shepherd or for the rangers. That's kind of much larger than catching the poacher. Therefore, they simply try to maximize the probability that the poacher that will be able to deter the poacher. But unfortunately, at this moment, if air shepherd didn't do anything, the poacher is actually going to kill the animal, which is a huge loss for the air shepherd. However, in this situation, the air shepherd actually has a informational advantage. That is, though the poacher only knows that there's a chance that the ranger is nearby, air shepherd actually knows exactly whether at this moment there is a ranger nearby or not. And so the question we're trying to ask is, can we utilize this informational advantage to improve the probability of deterring the poaching? Is there a question here?
No, there's no question.
Okay, good. Good. So, okay, so how can the air shepherd increase the probability of deterring the poacher? Let's kind of have a simple try. The first natural attempt you might think of is, why don't we always send a kind of alerting signal whenever we deter a poacher, whenever we see a poacher? Would such an idea work? The answer turns out to be no, because if you always send the alerting signal, then the poacher would essentially ignore your signal, just behave according to his prior belief about the situation. And in this situation, he would still continue poaching, and therefore the probability of deterring the poacher is still 0. The reason here is, if you always send the signal, then this signal doesn't carry anything specific about whether the ranger is nearby or not. So that will not affect the poacher's behavior. Okay, so this doesn't work. What about being truthful, right? So let's say, we're gonna always try to truthfully send the alerting signal to the poacher. That is, whenever there is a ranger nearby, we can send an alerting signal. And when there's no ranger nearby, we just keep silent. We don't do anything. And now from the poacher's perspective, he gonna, with probability 0.3, he will receive a warning signal. And from his past experience, he can gradually learn that given a warning signal, there is definitely a ranger who will be nearby. Therefore, it's better off for him to run away. And of course, if he didn't hear anything, he knows that there's no ranger nearby, so he can continue poaching. And therefore, in this case, we can improve the probability of deterring poaching to 0.3. So this is slightly better than the previous naively always sending the alerting signal. Now the question is, can we do even better than this 0.3, which is also the probability that the ranger is nearby? The answer actually turns out to be yes, and that is how we can strategically disclose information to actually improve the probability of deterring poacher to 0.6. So here's how it works. First of all, whenever there is a ranger nearby, we will definitely send the alerting signal. But even when there's no ranger nearby, with the probability, 3 out of the 7, we're still gonna send the alerting signal, and for the remaining probability, we will keep silent. And now from the poacher's perspective, when he receives the warning signal, he learned that it doesn't mean that there is definitely a ranger nearby, but he can do a simple posterior updates to infer that conditioning on this alerting, there's actually a half chance there's a ranger nearby, because this half of the probability flow comes from here and half of the flow comes from here. And it just turns out that this probability half is just large enough to deter the poaching, because the average of these two numbers turns out to be just below 0, which is a probability that the poacher is gonna run away. Therefore, in this case, it's better off for the poacher to run away. And that's the happy situation for the air shepherd. And this happens with the probability 0.6. So this example shows you that how the air shepherd can leverage his informational advantage about knowing where rangers are to significantly improve the probability of deterring poaching. And though this example was illustrated in the security domain, but the underlying phenomena actually is general enough. This is what people call the information design. Sometimes also it's also called the persuasion, which are kind of interchangeable name for it. Specifically, information design is trying to selectively disclose information to influence agents' decisions, and therefore, consequently, you can induce a desirable equilibrium outcome. And in the previous example, we're trying to induce the poacher to run away. So that's the desirable outcome for us. As I had mentioned at the beginning, such kind of information design is already ubiquitous in this digital era because of this unprecedented inconvenience today to access and also to transmit information. Not only in the both physical and the cyber security domain, it also happens a lot in like elections, advertising, marketing, negotiation, and the regulations. Many other applications. Therefore, it's not a surprise that it has led to a lot of recent works. I think a nice kind of summary about the importance of persuasion is actually the following title of a paper at the American Economic Review. It says that 1/4 of GDP is persuasion. In the large body of recent work on this information design, the most foundational model is perhaps this Bayesian persuasion model proposed by Kamenetsak and Jensko in 2011. This will also be the model that will mainly focus in this talk. This model basically is an abstraction of the previous example I have talked about before. In particular, here we're going to have two players, a persuader, whom we're going to call him the sender, and a decision maker, who is the receiver. In the previous example, air shepherd is a sender who's going to send alerting signals, and the poacher is a receiver who makes a decision about poaching or stop poaching. More generally, the receiver is going to have multiple actions from 1 to n, and every action I has a random type theta I, which will determine both the sender's utility and the receiver's utility. For example, in the previous case, theta I is whether a ranger is nearby or not. And if the poacher chooses to continue poaching, he will get a different utility, depends on whether a ranger is close by, in which case he get a penalty, or a ranger is not close by, in which case he get a reward. So this, we're going to call this combination of all the possible types together as we're going to collectively call it a state of nature theta, which is drawn from the common prior distribution. In previous example, it's basically probability 0.3 that a ranger is nearby, and the remaining probability the ranger is not nearby. The model assumes the information asymmetry between the sender and the receiver. In particular, the sender can observe the realized state of nature theta, can know exactly whether a ranger is nearby or not. But the receiver or the poacher only knows the probability about this event. The so-called information design problem is basically is a sender's optimization problem to design and commit to a signaling scheme that essentially is a randomized map from the states of nature theta to a set of signals. Therefore, through this signaling scheme, the sender can strategically reveal information to the receiver, therefore affect the receiver's decisions. Again, in the previous example, the signaling scheme is kind of randomized. So for example, when there's no ranger nearby, you sometimes send the alerting signal and sometimes you do not. And so that's next we will talk about algorithms for computing the optimal information design. Why we care about algorithms. So first of all, it will enable automated applications for this problem. For example, you want to encode the algorithm in the software for the drone. And also more important, another reason is that the algorithm can also help us to understand the possibility and the limitation of the model, and help us to see when efficient computation is possible, when it is not. Let me start with a simple case, when all the probabilities for this kind of states of nature are explicitly given and can be enumerated. And in this case, it turns out that there's a simple linear program that can compute the optimal signaling scheme in this kind of program here. I'm not expecting you to really understand to understand the details of the LP, but roughly it's basically saying the following. We're trying to maximize the expected sender utility subject to that the receiver would best respond to each signal. And moreover, the scheme should be feasible. That's basically what this program is trying to convey. So, this is nice. It turns out that, when your state of nature can be explicitly enumerated, we can compute the problem efficiently. As a computer scientist, typically what we like to ask is, when a polynomial time algorithm is possible, right? So you already know in this explicit situation, we can have a polynomial time algorithm. So what is the boundary? How far can we push this computability to, how far can we push the computability? Since the state of nature theta here is high dimensional, it contains a mini state for every action. Therefore, it's natural to examine compactly describe the prior distribution for this high dimensional variable. In this, we show that it turns out that the problem of optimal persuasion admits a polynomial time algorithm when those action types are IID, when these theta i's are IID, independent and identically distributed, but becomes sharply hard when the action types are independent but non-identically distributed. So I'll briefly highlight the challenge here for proving this result. So essentially the key challenge here is that the state here, theta, is high dimensional. So when the theta i's are IID from each other, the total possible combinations of the states are exponentially large. In particular, it's exponential in n, because the total number of combinations are large. Therefore, even writing down the scheme would take you exponential time, because your scheme have to specify for every theta which signal you're going to send. But there are exponentially many theta. You cannot even write the scheme down. Interestingly, it turns out that you can still show there is a efficient way to compute the optimal scheme. The key idea here is that since I have no hope to explicitly write down the scheme, the key idea here is that actually to compute an implicit scheme. In other words, what I'm going to compute is actually just a function f that will take any state of nature theta as input and then efficiently output a signal. And I'm going to guarantee you that this function will be operating in polynomial time. The main challenge here would be, would be to hope that in expectation of this function, we can maximize the sender's utility and subject to the receiver's incentives. And this is a key challenge that we have to handle. And that turns out actually indeed to be a difficult problem, because even computing the expectation over this variable theta for any kind of constant vector A here is already a sharply hard problem, let alone doing this kind of optimization over the distribution over theta. But interestingly, it turns out that we can leverage connection from auction theory in order to design an efficient algorithm for this independent identical case. But unfortunately, this problem becomes sharply hard once you slightly go beyond this independent identical situation. Now we know that this problem is hard in general. So the next question you might try to ask is, what is the best possible algorithm I can hope for then? I cannot get a polynomial time algorithm anymore. Can I get some kind of good approximation algorithm? Fortunately, the answer turns out to be yes. Actually, it turns out that you can get efficient approximation for a much more general setting even. It turns out that in this case, even when your prior distribution is some kind of given as an oracle that I can sample from, it can be arbitrary prior distribution. As long as I can sample from the distribution, I can compute an epsilon optimal scheme that runs in time polynomial in n one over 2. Yes. Oh, yeah. So though this result, sorry, is there a question? Oh no. So though this, this turns out to, interestingly, it turns out that this algorithm, which turns out to be the best you can achieve given the hardness result before, but the algorithm actually turns out to be somewhat simple. Essentially, it's the following. The input to my algorithm is the arbitrary state of nature theta drawn from the prior. What I'm going to do is I will try to solve the linear program I showed you before on the empirical distribution of polynomial many samples, plus this additional input theta, which was given to me as input. And then I will just signal as the linear program suggests for this particular theta that you give to me. The only slight caveat here is that I have to modify this LP slightly in order to prevent overfitting, but that's kind of the only thing. And it turns out that this simple algorithm is the best you can achieve, though the proof is actually, the proof requires a little bit kind of argument that I'm not going to show it here. Any questions here? Okay. So next I'm going to show, how we can apply this strategic information disclosure to real-world application problem, to the conservation problem I mentioned before. So far, I have shown you how you can, optimally signaling in order to deter the poaching. But that actually is not to apply this problem to the real-world application. There were actually additional challenges. In particular, as I have explained before, only the rangers can deter the poaching and can interdict the poaching. And the effectiveness of this signaling scheme is going to rely on the fact that there are rangers nearby. Therefore, this actually leads to a new challenge that we need to coordinate the locations of the rangers and the drones. There's a kind of, within this kind of national park, you want to assign the drones to some region and assign the rangers to another region. And the difficulty here is that you want to correlate their locations because we know that the effectiveness of our signaling scheme depends on the rangers nearby. But the signaling scheme also tells you that you don't have to always have the ranger nearby. As long as there is a good chance that the ranger are close by, you can do good. Use this kind of deceptive signaling idea. Therefore, this leads to the joint design of coordinating the ranger and the drone behavior, and then you try to do deceptive alerting via this information design approach. And what we're trying to do is we want to compute this kind of global optimal solution by combining both problems. This actually leads to the first security game model that try to integrate the patroller's interdiction functionality with the drone's strategic alerting functionality. Though interestingly, it actually turns out that this problem becomes NP hard. This combined problem becomes NP hard, though each of this separate problem actually was previously known to be polynomial time solvable. Combine them becomes hard. So in our work, we try to develop a fast approximation algorithm to solve this problem based on approaches from operation research. So I'll briefly show a kind of a simulation result, which shows how this kind of strategic signaling can help you significantly improve the defender's utility. In this figure, the y-axis is the defender's loss. Therefore, the lower, the better. So this red bar here is the optimal solution we get with the strategic signaling from drones. And the yellow bar here is, when you only use the drone to inform the nearby ranger, but do not do any signaling. Therefore, this gap here shows that how much you can gain by using the deceptive signaling. And the blue bar here is the situation where you don't use drone at all. Therefore, this gap shows that how much you can gain by using drones with strategic signaling. And this ratio, this kind of big ratio here shows that you can indeed significantly improve the defender's utility through such kind of strategic information design. That concludes my first part about algorithms for computation. Any questions so far before I jump to the second part? Okay, good. So in the next part, I'm gonna talk about how this real world problem, how the real world challenges motivate us to study the learnability of the optimal design. And as you can see that it turns out this kind of learnability of optimal design goes hand in hand into the robustness of the model as well. That's what I'm gonna talk next. So, we're pretty happy with this kind of, we thought this kind of a great idea that you can leverage information to deter poaching. But when we're trying to talk with the domain experts, it turns out that there were additional challenges that turns out to be crucial. That is, if you see this kind of signaling scheme, the effectiveness depends crucially on this prior probability for the ranger of the ranger's patrolling, which here is 0.3 and 0.7. But as you could imagine, this kind of probability of ranger patrolling is almost never accurate in reality, due to various kind of operational uncertainties. Even you thought that the ranger is going to show up here with probability 0.3, but due to many uncertainties, or some people wasn't be able to on duty, or some people got delayed on the road, these probabilities would never be accurate. Therefore, a natural question you might want to ask is, can we design optimal signaling scheme that is robust to some kind of small estimation error of these prior distributions?
So one quick question is whether this estimation error is on part of the drone or is on part of the poacher?
Is a part of the poacher. So the is the part of the is just the part is inaccurate in reality. So the ranger just don't show up with probably 0.3. Maybe it's just a 0.35 or 0.225.
I guess, but if the poacher observes that probability that the ranger is going to show up by, then I guess I'm not sure why there's an error. Because, yeah, so maybe I'm not quite understanding what you mean by error.
Oh, so yeah, so when the air chauffeur is trying to do the planning, right? They know that there's a planned probability, which is 0.3, the ranger show up, 0.7, the ranger don't show up. But the question is, what this planned probability, based on which we computed the optimal signaling scheme, is this planned probability really exact in reality? Can we guarantee that the ranger would exactly show up with probability 0.3? We cannot.
Got it.
Right? Because this kind of various uncertainty in the schedule. So therefore, the natural question you want to ask is, can we design a scheme that somehow is robust to some small estimation error, right? It's going to work even when the probability is 0.28, right, for example. So this, therefore, to tackle this question, so the natural first attempt we might think about is the following way. So let's say we have an approximate prior P tilde that we know is close by to the exact prior P star, maybe it's 0.3. But we know that is close by, but not exact. Then the natural idea you would think of is I can compute the optimal signaling scheme X tilde with respect to the P tilde. And then I'm hoping that this X tilde would also be good even under the true prior P star when the epsilon was small. When my P tilde is nearby P star. That's a pretty natural idea. Actually, if you recall, this is the textbook style approach for supervised learning as well. If you think about how we do this kind of empirical risk minimization for classification or for regression, what we do is we get a lot of samples, then we try to minimize the empirical risk. And that is effectively equivalent to compute the best classifier with respect to the P tilde, with respect to the empirical distribution. And then you are hoping that this empirical solution would be good with respect to your true distribution P star. It's kind of the standard empirical risk minimization approach. And unfortunately, it turns out that in this multi-agent system, this approach turns out to fail. That is, you can show that there are instances such that the above empirical risk minimization approach is going to be arbitrarily far away from optimality, regardless how small your epsilon is, regardless how accurate your P tilde is. Okay. Actually, the explanation here is already clear in this example already. So if you recall, this is the example we have just seen before. And a crucial argument we had before is conditioning on this alerting signal. There's a half chance the ranger is nearby and half chance there's no ranger nearby. And that half was just large enough to deter the poaching behavior. And therefore, you can see in this problem, if I overestimate this probability 0.3, that is going to be a disastrous for the defender, because if I maybe the true probability actually is 0.25, but I overestimate it as 0.3, and therefore I wouldn't be able to get the probability half here for the ranger's presence, and that would make my alerting signal to fail and don't function well. And that is a disastrous for the defender. And on the other hand, if I underestimate this probability, that actually is not a super big issue, because if if the true probability was 0.35, but I estimate it as 0.3, then that's not too bad, because the probability of a ranger nearby here is actually even larger than half. Therefore, my signal would be able to function.
So the assumption, a question here, so the assumption is that the poacher is able to observe the exact probability.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. The assumption here is the poacher would be able to observe, or more accurately, would be able to experience the true probability, because he's the person who is in the field and trying to experience in the poacher nearby, the rangers nearby. And this kind of asymmetric cost for overestimating and underestimating turns out to make the problem not smooth, and that is exactly the reason that it fails. That's exactly that it fails if you just do optimization based on the p-tilde. So how can we handle this kind of challenge? It turns out that the remedy here is to do robust information design. If you recall the problem, there's the problem we're facing is the following. There's a true prior P star around that I cannot observe, but what I know is some P tilde that is nearby the true prior. So what I would try to do, the key idea here is I will try to optimize against the worst P that are nearby this P tilde. So specifically, what I'm going to do is I will define an uncertainty set that is basically an L1 ball centered around this P tilde, measured in L1 distance, within epsilon. By definition, I know that the P star is within this ball, but I don't know where it is within the ball. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute the scheme that will maximize the worst case utility among all the possible P here, which include the P star, but I'm going to do the worst case analysis within this region. Okay, and mathematically, what I'm doing is the following. So I'm trying to maximize the Sanders utility, where X is the scheme I'm looking for, but I'm trying to maximize the worst case utility, where the worst case is by the reflected in this minimization problem within it by picking the worst prior P within the region. And this is what I'm going to do. And what I'm hoping is by doing this robust information design, I can get a solution that is close to this optimal solution, in which case I know exactly the P star. I was hoping this term can be close to the situation I know exactly the P star, which is the optimal solution here. Specifically, what I'm going to look at is going to be the gap between these two terms. And you can easily see that this gap is actually always be non-negative, because my P star is included in this region. Therefore, the minimum amount of P would only make this term smaller. So the gap would always be greater or equal to 0. So the question here is, can we upper bound this gap epsilon? Can we show that this gap epsilon actually is going to tends to 0 as epsilon goes to tends to 0? And note that this answer is not trivial, because it also depends on the approach you are using. In the previous slides, I showed you that this gap may be arbitrarily bad regardless how small your epsilon is. Fortunately, it turns out that if you do this kind of robust information design, we can show that for any Bayesian persuasion problem, you can show the gap is always upper bounded by a linear term of epsilon. And moreover, you can show the optimal robust signaling scheme can be computed in polynomial time. I will briefly highlight the proof idea here. So the first conclusion I want to prove is upper bounding this gap, which I rewrote it here again. The challenge here is that it turns out it's very difficult to directly analyze this kind of max-min problem, which actually is non-convex in general, by the way. So what we do is we take a detour and we're trying to prove that, I don't know how to optimize, analyze this exact optimal thing. But what I'm going to do is I'll try to prove there exists a good robust scheme that have a small gap. If I show such an existence, then this optimal thing would only do better. So, and to show the existence of such a good robust scheme, it turns out that we can explicitly construct and then analyze a scheme that turns out to work well. And that is how we show that this gap in general can be upper bounded by an order of epsilon. In the second part, we will need to solve this kind of a max-min problem, which is not convex in general, but it turns out that there's a primal dual approach where we can use the primal to search for the optimal scheme and use the dual to come up with the worst P for us to optimize. And you might wonder, can I do something better than this order of epsilon? Maybe, can I do optimal order of epsilon square, which is even better? But actually, the answer turns out to be no. It turns out that we can show this upper bound linear dependence on epsilon upper bound is tight. You cannot do better because there exists a Bayesian persuasion instance such that the gap is also lower bounded by a linear term of epsilon. So this epsilon dependence is the best you can hope for. As a remark, so though this kind of result appears to be kind of quite simple to state, actually in multi-agent systems, such kind of linear dependence on the estimation error of your system parameter is not obvious in advance at all, and is also not generally true. This case happens to be a nice case. This is reflected in another widely studied domain, which is about the single item auction design. It turns out that only recently there is a similar result that was proved to have a similar result proved in this spirit. In particular, there's a result by Guo, Jordan, and then Paticus. They show that in optimal auction design, the optimal revenue also have a linear dependence on the estimation error of the bidders' distributions, which is similar in spirit to our result here. And it turns out that such kind of robustness result about your problem goes hand in hand to the learnability of the optimal design as well. And that is what I'm going to show next. So let's now consider let's now move to a kind of more general machine learning problem. Let's say you want to learn the optimal signaling from samples. Here's a setup. Let's say your instance is not explicitly given in advance, but what you have is actually the sender can only access samples of the state manager theta draw from the distribution P star. Okay, what we're trying to study is how many samples I will need in order to learn an epsilon optimal signaling scheme. It turns out that the previous robustness result easily implies that you will need roughly 1 over epsilon square number of samples to learn the epsilon optimal scheme, and this is also necessary. So this kind of 1 over epsilon square is a tight sample complexity bound for learning the optimal signaling scheme. And the algorithm for achieving this tight learnability result is also very simple, which we call robustness against ignorance. It's basically the following. You're going to compute some empirical distribution P tilde using this 1 over epsilon square many samples. Then what you do is you just compute a robust optimal signaling scheme, which recall that you do this kind of max-min problem. And the previous result essentially easily implies that this is going to give you an epsilon optimal scheme, because with high probability, you can guarantee that this P tilde is going to be within distance epsilon to the true distribution P star. And the robustness result already implies that the optimal signaling scheme is going to be close by as well. Okay, so that's
can you, I mean, just in terms of practical results, maybe you can take this after your talk is over, but what does it mean for 1 over epsilon square samples for actual patrolling example that you've shown?
So essentially, so first of all, this learnability result is kind of we're trying to look at the more abstract persuasion model.
Sure.
But in the conservation domain, it basically means if the drone was able to observe roughly 1 over epsilon squared interactions from the past, he will automatically be able to figure out the optimal way to do the signaling.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to understand how many samples that would be, but you can take this after the talk is over because I guess you're coming close to the end.
Yeah, that's right. So I showed that this kind of yields the efficient sample complexity. And additional benefit of understanding this robustness result is actually you can make sure this kind of learning result would be robust to sample corruptions, which is a valid concern in this conservation domain, in this adversarial environments. In particular, if your samples if some fraction, let's say alpha fraction of your samples are kind of corrupted, in this case, you can still obtain the alpha approximation optimal solution, because when the alpha fraction of the sample are corrupted, you can guarantee that the distribution you are learning is just alpha away from the true prior distribution P star. And the robustness result automatically gives you an alpha approximation of the optimal solution. So just a quick remark is that this kind of packet learning result holds for quite general persuasion models and also applicable to many other domains as well. There's a question here. Yeah, so good. That also concludes the talk. And so to briefly summarize, I talked about this kind of information design, which turns out to be intrinsic in many human activities. And I tried to sketch a kind of algorithmic theory, so that which kind of is crucial for automated applications today. And during this talk, I covered the computation algorithms and the learnability about a foundational model in this information design. As for future directions, so far I have only talked about how you can strategically reveal information to a single adversary or to a single receiver. And in general, we can talk about, you can information design to reveal information to multiple receivers and in other real-world multi-agent systems as well. Another interesting direction that I think is particularly important is try to understand the robustness of economic models to inaccurate parameter estimations and the resultant learnability problem about the economic model. I have covered this kind of simple and basic persuasion problem, but you can really ask this question in many kind of game theoretical models. For example, what about the robustness of stackable equilibrium? What if our knowledge about the follower payoff was slightly off from the true payoff? Can you guarantee that your solution is also robustly good? And can you learn the optimal stackable equilibrium as well? And you can ask this similar question at the problem, like how to robustly learn the recommendations for users, how to robustly learn to classify strategic agents, and so on. That brings me to the end of the talk. I just want to conclude with a kind of quote, a kind of highly cited vision that I really liked a lot by Robert Wilson, who was also a recent Nobel laureate. So he says that I foresee the progress of game theory as depending on successive reductions in the base of common knowledge required. That's it for the talk. Thank you. And happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for the very interesting talk. I mean, let's thank with a very big applause.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so now we can open the floor for questions. So please, we can take like 2 questions. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions directly. Okay, I have a one question. Let me start with that. So I was wondering, when you talk about probabilities for this real time events, what would probability mean for you? Like, is it looking at, so when you say that the poachers might know the probability or rangers might know the probability, so what are these probabilities? And when we say that it's not correct, is it like not correct because we haven't seen enough samples?
So the probabilities are basically the poachers perceive based on his past experience, right? He has been in the field doing the poaching. Sometimes he get caught, sometimes he didn't get caught, and he can gradually form a belief about what is the probability he will get caught. And that is, the true probability happens in reality. And why we have such a probability and why sometimes he get caught, he didn't get caught, because there's a rangers who are trying to plan in the patrolling, patrol path so that he can, cover different area. But the problem here is that when ranger is planning to cover some region with some probability, that may not necessarily be true, will be exactly implemented in reality, because due to various operational uncertainties. So that is why the probability we're originally planning may be different from what's truly happening in the field.
Got it.
Yeah.
Right, and it's interesting to see the bounds. So we have been working on similar problems where it's very difficult to give any, like we showed that it can be arbitrarily bad if there's like some uncertainty instead of like exact numbers. I think that's kind of true for most of the NP hard problems or like very hard problems. Like even if you have small estimation errors, your optimization can be very bad. But it's great to see like there are bounds in the specific context that we are looking at.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So I think typically it would depend. You will really need to think carefully about the approach to get a small bound. So as I was showing in the previous slides, if you simply just doing the empirical risk minimization style of a standard technique, it will also give you very bad bounds. So that actually is also the key difficulty in another kind of domain, which is auction design. That's why it took them I think the study of sample complexity for auction design starts about 10 years ago. And it's only recently they proved that this kind of, there is a way to help you to get a linear dependence on the error.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So one other question with respect to the robustness I had was, here you seem to have taken the perspective of the drone, the signaler, to try to adjust to the fact that the actual probability of patrols might be different from the stated probabilities, for example. However, in past work, there has been more emphasis of the patroller themselves knowing that there will be errors in patrols, and therefore trying to come up with patrol strategies that are more robust to patrolling in the first place. So, for example, there's a paper by Zheng Yu Yin in AAA I11, and there are other papers like that. And so there, the emphasis is on the patroller saying, I just want to be robust to, patrollers not showing up, et cetera, et cetera. If one were to take such a perspective from the patroller side, would that lead to a different result? Are the two equivalent in some way, whether you are robust at the signaler level, or you're robust at the patroller level? Would those lead to different results?
I think that would not resolve the challenge we're trying to handle here.
Okay.
Because the uncertainty I was talking here is the uncertainty due to operational inaccuracy. Right, regardless of what patrolling strategy at the end of the day you get from January's AAA paper, at the end of the day, you have a probability distribution that you want to deploy, right? But that probability distribution would not be perfect in the real world when you are really trying to deploy it, because no one can exactly implement the probability in the real world.
Right. So I guess I mean, their idea was that, we know, let's say that the patrollers are not going to show up with the, some probability and so forth. And they're trying to be robust by coming up with patrolling strategies that are robust to such lack of precision on part of the patroller. So I guess if we were to sort of think about, so I understand what you're saying, but I guess I'm trying to understand the relationship of somebody trying to be robust at the patrolling stage itself, combined with you're trying to be robust at the signaling stage.
Yeah. So
so whereas I understand that wouldn't negate the work you have shown, I'm trying to understand the interaction between the two, whether that would lead to anything different, or I don't know, maybe it makes that work obsolete. Maybe they shouldn't worry about it, because what they're worried about is that basically an attacker would see the probability being different from what it is actually, because the patrollers didn't show up. And because of that, then the attacker would attack, because the probabilities are not what were actually going to be implemented. So it could be the case that because now the signaling, though, is still taking all of that into account, that we don't need to be robust in the patrol generation stage, because the signaling will compensate for that lack of robustness. I guess I realize that we are over, so we can stop here and we can discuss it just on our own if need.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, sounds good.
Oh, okay. So I guess if we don't have time for any further questions, but feel free